Have you ever been wondering why Frodo lives in Buckland with Bilbo? Or what happened to Frodo's parents? Today we will explore this topic together and also address the rumors and theories that surrounds their tragic end. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Lore of Arda. Today we will talk about the parents of Frodo Baggins. Before we get to the point where I talk about how they died, I think we should talk a little about the lives of Drogo and Primula, as that will give us a deeper understanding of why the tragic event even happened. First off, Drogo Baggins was born in 2908 and was the second child of Fosco Baggins and Ruby Bolger. He had an older sister named Dora and a little brother that would be born 3 years later, named Dudo. Primula Brandybuck was the youngest daughter of Gorbadoc Brandybuck and Mirabella Took. She likely grew up in Brandywine in Buckland, as her father was the master of Buckland and had been so for 10 years when she was born in 2920. We don't hear much about them as children. What we hear from Sam's father, it sounds like Drogo was a rather average hobbit you couldn't say much about. When they got married, however, it seems like Drogo moved to Buckland and perhaps even moved in to live with his wife in the Brandywine. Gorbadoc was said to have been a generous host, and it seems like Drogo and him had a rather good relationship to each other. We don't know much about Mirabella Took, except that she was said to have been a remarkable woman and felt not entirely hobbit-like. She was the sister to Belladonna Took, the mother of Bilbo Baggins. As Drogo began to live in Buckland, he also began to adopt the local customs, and one of these was to boating on the Brandywine River, which he seemed to have done at least a few times. This was a custom that seemed rather strange and unnatural for most hobbits in the Shire, so I guess it would have taken a few trips before Drogo got used to it. We don't actually know if he ever learned how to swim, but I'll get back to that later. In 2963, Gorbadoc Brandybuck died of old age at the age of 105. His oldest son, Rumours Brandybuck, became the new master and inherited the Brandywine. From all we know, things didn't seem to change. Both Drogo and Primula seemed to continue their life in the Brandywine. 5 years later, in 2968, Frodo was born and lived at the Brandywine with his parents. When Frodo was 12 years old, his parents went boating on the Brandywine River. For unknown reasons, an accident happened, and both his parents tragically drowned in the river. In the Fellowship of the Ring book, we hear some of the local hobbits of Hobbiton gossip about how they drowned, and I will now present their viewpoint. But at the same time, I would like to stress that none of the characters know what exactly happened, and that it is more likely rumors than anything else, so keep that in mind. Old Noakes blames Drogo for the accident and basically claims he was so fat it made the boat sink. Based on the other notes we got on Drogo, I think it's fair to conclude that he might have been a bit choppy even for a hobbit. But to claim that his weight would make the boat sink is rather absurd. Wouldn't the boat have sunk at the dock when he went into it, and not out on the river? If that part is wrong, his statement about them sailing out in the moonlight might be wrong as well, and only said for dramatic effect. The second rumor comes from Ted Sandyman, the miller of Hobbiton. This rumor is quite more disturbing. He claims that Primula tried to kill Drogo by pushing him into the water, but that he dragged her down with him. Ted Sandyman is quite a storyteller, and Sam's father didn't like him much because of his tall tales and quick judgment of others. So I don't think we should believe this vicious rumor for a second. There are no notes that indicates that the relationship between Drogo and Primula was in a bad state. We never really get to know the true story of what happened, and there are several theories on the matter, though I would say most of them are quite wild and not very likely to be true. I do want to present my own theory on the matter, however. It has to do with the fact that most hobbits don't like water, and many of them can't swim, much like we see Samwise Gamgee struggle until Frodo saves him, a moment that must have meant more to Frodo than what we would expect. Wouldn't this moment have reminded him of how his own parents drowned? My theory is that Drogo never learned how to swim, or that neither of them did. While they were sailing on the Brandywine River, some sort of accident happened, as they sometimes do. Perhaps there was a water leaking into the boat, or perhaps one of them lost balance and the boat tipped over, and they both fell into the water. Whatever the case may be, they somehow both ended up in the water. If Primula knew how to swim, she might have tried to save her husband, but in her attempt risked her own life. Now that's at least my own theory on the matter. Let me know if you agree or if you have a better theory. There's also a theory that Gollum somehow was behind their death, but I think that's a rather absurd theory, especially if you consider that Gandalf claims Gollum never visited the Shire. And other than that, it's noted that Gollum meets Shelob for the first time in this exact year, so unless Gollum can fast travel between Mordor and the Shire, I think we can debunk the theory once and for all. I don't think it's that important how they died, but rather the fact that they did and how that affected Frodo's life. Becoming an orphan at 12 must not have been easy, and to deal with the death of both your parents on the same day cannot have been easy either. Luckily for Frodo, he was taken care of by his uncle Rory Mac at Brandywine. One cannot help but wonder if Frodo ever thought about them. Despite their tragic death, he actually never mentions it, and perhaps that is exactly how he deals with the trauma. Later on, Bilbo would adopt him as his heir, and he would move in to live with him at Buckland. Perhaps Bilbo saw something in Frodo that reminded him of himself. I could probably make an entire episode about Frodo's childhood, so let me know if you want to see that in a future episode. Now, I usually don't talk a lot about Tolkien's life, but I did see some similarities between Frodo and Tolkien himself, and I thought I would like to share it with you all. Tolkien's parents were named Arthur and Mabel, and he grew up in South Africa under British rule. At the age of 3, he visited England with his mother and brother, but before his father could join them, he died. After that, he grew up in England with his mother, that also became his teacher. She taught him about plants, and it was back then Tolkien began to have a love for plants, flowers, and trees. When Tolkien was 12, his mother died of diabetes. There's a lot more to say about Tolkien's life, but I think the interesting part here is that Tolkien became an orphan at the same age that Frodo did. I don't think it's a coincidence that Frodo's mother is named after a flower, a rather beautiful gesture.